My recent memory seems to be filled with public discourse about the police, particularly with regards to their conduct, institutional prejudice, and of course their use of violence. In modern society, the use of such violence is restricted to state institutions such as the police, and as such they are entrusted with a responsibility to use it only when necessary and only as much as needed. However, reality has shown us that the flaws in entrusting an institution like the police with the means to apply violence to a civilian population is risky at best. With police murders continuing to punctuate the news and assertions of racism, sexism, homophobia and rampant right-wing entryism into both the UK and US police, we do have to have a think about these things. Now, despite all of this, talk of policing in UK politics continues to remain firmly in the more cops equals less crime bracket, with Keir Starmer's Labour promising another 13,000 additional police and PCSOs in their latest commitment to solve crime. Sadly, the politicisation, is that even a word? Politicisation? Sadly, the politicisation of criminal justice means that many policies end up being little more than a PR exercise aimed at reducing the fear of crime, as opposed to the consequences of actual crime, or heaven forfend, the causes. It wasn't always this way, and as touched on in episode 189 of Podcasting as Praxis, once again it became a going concern due to everybody's favourite resident of hell, Thatcher. Public perception of criminal justice as a political issue was a relatively fringe concern until it was turned into the huge industry and PR battleground that it is today by Thatcher. The public's fear of crime, particularly violent crime, is a genuine feature of political discussion now, as is the more recent phenomenon of the public's fear of the police, which creates both a problem and an opportunity. The problem is that, as already mentioned, political discourse on crime normally revolves around numbers and a more police equals less crime kind of logic that doesn't really bear any relation to reality, and is even less of a desirable outcome given the amount of crime being created by police in recent headlines. However, the opportunity exists for us to explore the problem of crime and consider whether the police as they exist are the right solution or whether the left should be arguing for an alternative approach. I want to take you on a journey that will look at our understanding of crime, the societal demands we place on the police at the moment, and the alternatives that exist to perhaps fulfil those demands in a different way. This will be a largely UK-centric exploration. There will be also a number of things that will apply to many forces in many other countries too. Let us begin our journey by looking at where our police came from, how they have developed, and why that explains why the police are the way they are. If one were to attempt to make from scratch a criminal justice system fit for contemporary society, it would not be at all like the one we have today. Godfrey and Lawrence, Crime and Justice, 1750 to 1950, 2005. Even though primitive incarnations of criminal justice systems have been a feature of human society since long before the first truncheon, the idea of a dedicated professional police force is still a relatively modern affair. Prior to the Industrial Revolution in the UK, most towns had watchmen and volunteer patrols that would handle the maintenance of public order and the apprehension of those accused of crimes, with communities expected to handle the finer details of trials and punishments, whether via magistrates, tribunals, or just a good old-fashioned public thrashing. However, as the country began to industrialise, populations in cities increased, and concerns about the population density of the poor grew amongst the wealthier elements in society, as the population went from peasants operating under the divine rule of kings to workers toiling at the will of mere mortals. Even from this early stage, we can identify where the call for a barrier between the poor and the rich came from, and what the primary concern was, that being the protection of the few from the many. This ties in with the radical analysis of policing as a tool of maintaining inequality, as per the following excerpt from the Oxford Handbook of Criminology. A well-known study of 51 pre-industrial societies found police, in the sense of a specialised armed force used partially or wholly for norm enforcement, in only 20 of these. Schwartz and Miller, 1964. Policing may originate in collective and communal processes of social control, but specialised police forces develop hand in hand with the emergence of social inequality, hierarchy, and more centralised dominant state systems. Spitzer, 1975. To put it another way, as far as anthropological investigations can surmise, the formation of a dedicated police force tends to go hand in hand with an imbalance of power and resources in a society, which would seem to chime with the views of the wider political left when considering the purpose of the police. It perhaps follows quite logically that where there exist people with a more than average amount of a resource, others may seek to take some of that resource to redress that imbalance. In this scenario, it would not be surprising perhaps that those who had the extra resource would perhaps leverage it to ensure that their position was protected in some way. During the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, there were a number of riots, protests and international incidents that increased the concerns of the moneyed and empowered to examine further the need for a dedicated form of social control, or public order, to use a phrase you hear much more often these days. Up to this point in time, military units had been used to handle large-scale public unrest, but after incidents such as the tragedy of Peterloo in 1819, where a cavalry unit charged into a peaceful protest and killed several protesters, the government of the time understood that such spectacles were further destabilising what was an already volatile social situation. A magistrate and merchant named Patrick Colquhoun had a twin impact on this profession, both with their treatise on the police of the metropolis, which made the case for a full-time London-based police force, and their establishment of the Wapping River Police, an embryonic precursor to the British police, who patrolled the waterways to dissuade smugglers and ensure everyone paid their import taxes. The success of these river police in this endeavour and the growing discontent in Europe helped to increase the pressure on the government of the time to ensure that in 1829 Robert Peel somewhat reluctantly created the first official police force of the UK. Peel made very clear in his public announcements that the police were to be a force for social order and not just another wing of the military. The principal object to be obtained is the prevention of crime. To this, great and every effort of the police is to be directed. The security of the person and property will thus be better affected than by detection and punishment of the offender after he has succeeded in committing the crime. Please note that first line. Principal object to be obtained is the prevention of crime. Essentially, the day-to-day task of this police force was similar to that of the existing town watch, with small patrols of police walking the streets in a visible and accessible way, albeit armed with truncheons, cutlasses and the odd pistol. Now, despite some public misgivings about the intent of such a force, it was deemed successful enough by the government of the time that in 1856 they instituted the County and Borough Police Act, which made it mandatory for any region that hadn't already set up a police force to do so. Historically, those on the conservative and liberal side of politics consider the introduction of a professional police force to have been an essential act, an inevitable evolution of a civilised society, as part of some imagined track of progress towards enlightenment. This seems a somewhat arrogant conceit to me, where we maintain that what exists must exist because we are on the optimal path, and that any other choice would have been detrimental in some way. Yet policing, much like agriculture, industry and militarisation, are often treated like steps on the civilisational ladder to modernity, being inevitable and universally a good thing. Anyone that's ever played like Civilization will kind of get the idea there. More recent musings, such as The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, have already debunked a number of assumptions we make regarding the progress of civilisations, and point out that there is rarely one route to modernity, or even progress at all. And I think we should consider the police to be one possible response to inequality and crime, but not an inevitability. It must not be forgotten that from its very formation, the police force was instituted by the ownership class to stop smugglers from avoiding import taxes on the river, and then to help quell growing public disorder. As identified in my video on class interest, if something is designed to serve one class, it will eventually conflict with the class interests of another. So let us collect our thoughts before we move on. The police are not an old institution in the grand scheme of things. Civilization survived a long time without a specialised policing force, and when it was created, it was in reality to protect the established hierarchy in the face of growing political and social disquiet. It is important to consider that the formation of the first official police force in the UK happened shortly after revolutions in Spain, Italy, Portugal and Greece, and only 30 years after the French Revolution, which ably demonstrated the risks of ignoring civil unrest. In fact, not long after this formation, we were to see further revolutions in Belgium and France, showing that Europe was pregnant with discontent and revolutionary fervour, suggesting that perhaps the ruling classes were correct in their assessment that there was a need for a new form of social control. So if the police were formed officially to prevent crime and unofficially to preserve the hierarchy and wealth of the ownership class in Britain, how much of that is still true today? To understand that, we will need to look at what the societal and political demands are of the modern police force, and to see if we can identify where the manner of its creation has led it to today. In 2017, a report was commissioned by the UK Police Foundation and the Policy Studies Institute to look into the role and responsibilities of the police. In this report, they endorsed the use of the police service's statement of common purpose. The purpose of the police service is to uphold the law fairly and firmly, to prevent crime, to pursue and bring to justice those who break the law, to keep the Queen's peace, to protect, help and reassure the community, and to be seen to do this with integrity, common sense and sound judgment. Now, the report that quotes this purpose statement from the police service itself does also identify it has become increasingly clear that the police can only have a relatively limited impact on aggregate crime statistics, and indeed that the whole criminal justice apparatus can only ever be one part in an overall strategy to reduce crime. If the police themselves see themselves as just a player in crime reduction, but not the driver of it, one has to then question why party politics focuses so much on the police as an answer to public concerns, especially since the police themselves are involving themselves with the solving of crime less and less. To Wikipedia, the proportion of cases solved dropped from 15.5% in 2015 to 7.4% in 2019, which is a record low. Across England and Wales, the percentage of solved burglaries almost halved during the 7 years preceding 2021, from 32,000 out of 342,000 cases, which is 9.5%, to 14,000 out of 268,000 cases, which is 5.4% in 2021 to 2022. Even worse than that, and an even bigger indicator of where the police see their time being best spent, is seen in the drop in police even attending a crime at all, according to the following from the BBC. In the year to March, that being 2022, Home Office figures showed just 6.3% of robbery offences and 4.1% of thefts in England and Wales resulted in charges, while recent figures found police attendance at burglaries in London had fallen to 50%. 50%. I suppose if resources are strained, the police have to choose between putting their resources into crime prevention, crime solving, or public order. But how do they make such a difficult choice? The report says, clearly there may be occasions when police priorities conflict. Where this is the case, we have no hesitation in reiterating Lord Scarman's emphasis on the importance of maintaining public order in the last resort. He stated that in the event of a conflict of aims between the maintenance of public tranquility and enforcement of the law, the former should be the primary responsibility of the police. Capitalism is truly a system of contradictions that exists on a bedrock of inequality, hierarchy and exploitation. One of the reasons that this system doesn't instantly topple over under the weight of its own injustice is the presence of potential state violence in the guise of the police force. Once we are thinking of the police as part of this protective mechanism, particularly under what has been a succession of neoliberal governments in the UK and US, it is perhaps no surprise to learn that private sector involvement in policing has been broached on a number of occasions, and even warrants its own subsection in that 2017 report. Indeed, the private sector has responded quite remarkably to the public desire for greater security, and this has increasingly brought it into areas we traditionally associate with public policing. In part, this has been facilitated by important changes in the use of public space, in particular the development of private shopping malls, creating new private areas to which the public has access. These are areas which tend to be policed by private security employees. I've seen this sort of transformation where I live, where the town centre was effectively bought out and reimagined as a community and retail space, where the admittedly dated 80s town centre was transformed into a shiny but slightly soulless commerce zone. This new zone was haughtily rebranded and now has its own rules, which are enforced by its very own police force, with the reminder that this is not public land anymore. Simple transgressions such as riding a bicycle through the high street or using your phone to take pictures became verboten overnight. Such an aggressive overreach by the private sector seems entirely in keeping with Owen Hafley's observations on private retail spaces such as Bluewater in his 2014 book A New Kind of Bleak. The American architect who designed Bluewater opined in a fascinating 2008 interview that Bluewater is a city rather than a retail destination. In terms of its size and population, this is true. So we need to evaluate exactly what kind of city this is. A city with one ceremonial entrance, which can only be entered by a vehicle where nothing is produced, but where many things are consumed. The only sort of regime that could set up such a controlled, channeled city is a dictatorship or an oligarchy. Neatly enough, Kuhn explicitly praises benevolent despotism and critiques the very notion of democratic city planning. So far, we have touched on criminology, anthropology, and even architecture. But what does this tell us about police in the 21st century? It tells us that the police exist, in the words of the very institutions that evaluate and shape the police force itself, with an emphasis on the importance of maintaining public order in the last resort. We have come full circle from the formation of a state-sanctioned force to face down the growing threat of the strikes, protests and revolutions of the 19th century, to an increasingly militarised 21st century police force that appears to be reducing its involvement in the solving and prevention of crime to instead focus on the maintenance of public order. This function continues to grow in importance as the UK continues to struggle with increased inflation, increased inequality, a second wave of austerity politics, and the lack of any potential economic recovery for ordinary people. The stocks of riot shields and batons continue to be replenished, and vanfuls of police descend upon every royal and sporting event where high-value institutions require public order, for the public to be reminded of the violent power of the state. In the final chapter of the Oxford Handbook of Criminology, Tim Newbin and Robert Rayner discuss the future of policing. There is a substantial body of research evidence, much of it emanating from the Home Office Research and Planning Unit, suggesting that policing resources and tactics have a tenuous relationship to levels of crime or the clear-up rate. Clark and Howe, 1980-1984, Bailey, 1994, Morgan and Newbin, 1997, Rayner, 2000. Newbin and Rayner continue, police are primarily the managers of crime and the keepers of the peace, not a vehicle for reducing crime substantially. Crime is the product of deeper social forces, largely beyond the ambit of any policing tactics, and the clear-up rate is a function of crime levels and other aspects of workload rather than police efficiency. If we accept both the 2017 Police Foundation report and the theorising of criminologists like Newbin and Rayner, then we must accept crime can't be fought simply with state violence and flashing lights, but instead must be understood as a layered and complex social phenomena. Whether we believe the police are the gloved fist of government keeping the public under control, or a crime-fighting force designed to prevent and solve crime, the ultimate result seems to be that they are unable to have much of an impact on crime either way. So why don't we try something different? I wasn't originally going to do a section on institutional prejudice just yet. I was going to include it in a later video, one talking about the alternatives that are available to the police. It thematically fit better there from a planning perspective. But on my way to work, when I was writing this the other day, I spotted the cover of the Metro on my bus to work, and the headline read, "Damning verdict on the Met. Misogynists, homophobes and racists." This was too big an elephant in the room not to mention when we start discussing the police. The headline refers to a report compiled by Baroness Casey, who has judged the Metropolitan Police Force as institutionally sexist, racist and homophobic, in news that is probably not going to really shock anybody that's, read any newspapers in the last 40 years. In 1999, the Macpherson inquiry, a heavily publicised investigation into the circumstances surrounding the murder of black teenager Stephen Lawrence whilst in police custody, found very much the same issues, and yet 24 years later, the same problem persists. Indeed, as The Guardian points out in an article on the same day, in 1972, newly appointed Met Police Commissioner Robert Mark said he had never experienced blindness, arrogance and prejudice on anything like the scale accepted as routine in the Met. These accusations are generally treated with the old "a few bad apples" and "not all cops," "a few token baddies are sacked," or retired early, and then the cycle kind of begins again. Because of course it's not just a few bad apples, is it? There is simply too much to cover on prejudice in the police force to do any sort of justice in this video. From the obvious and consistent racism indicated in stop and search rates, excessive violence, poor treatment of non-white victims, to the shocking amount of serving police officers charged with sexual and domestic violence offences, to the continuing failures of the police to eradicate homophobia and anti-trans rhetoric within their own forces, let alone beyond it. For a large number of people in this country, and indeed in other countries too, the police do not represent safety or a public service, but instead are essentially a hostile and unpredictable armed gang, who are well versed in turning a blind eye to behaviour considered criminal outside of the uniform. This section has not been as thoroughly researched or referenced as the others, given its last-minute inclusion in this episode, and as such, this can be quite easily called an emotive and hyperbolic section. But for me, my politics is strongly linked to my emotion, and while I try and provide arguments that are based in logic and academically referenced where possible, this is YouTube, and I wanted to say something about this, so here we are. Anyway, moving on. So we have looked at why the police were formed and who effectively formed them. We have examined the circumstances around their founding and established a commonality with some early civilizations identified by anthropologists, that being that inequality and imbalance tend to lead to a violent force to maintain that inequality. Defunding the police isn't just an emotional backlash against the unchecked violence of those empowered by the state, though it is that too. It is also a stark assessment of the performance of the police against their own objectives. The police were stated to have been formed in the UK to prevent crime, but the police themselves have admitted that they can have, at best, a limited impact on crime rates. The lived reality is, of course, that the police's main priority is to maintain social order, or perhaps to put it more honestly, to maintain social control, and to preserve the inequalities present in our country. They say exactly that in their review, and frankly, we only have to see the difference in resource expenditure between that spent on policing crime in poorer residential areas than the amount of police that can be mustered around any protest or royal event. The police are fundamentally unable to stop or even consistently reduce crime. They know it, and we know it. In episode 2, we will be looking at criminological theories of crime, to really understand why crime happens, what we can do to reduce it, and why it needn't be the police we rely on to do so. Thank you for watching this episode. We're hoping to do another couple of videos on this and make a little series about it, so if you've enjoyed it, please give it a like to help it get out there, and subscribe to make sure that you're notified when the next videos do come out. Otherwise, take care of yourself, look after each other, join a union, and I'll see you again real soon. Thanks. Bye.